myself or just Travers with any, and we will say them out loud so members can answer them at the end. But otherwise, I will let Brett Farhat get started.
Thank you, Tracy. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you all for joining us to discuss the Michigan House Democrats' vision for K through 12. Many of you have read the reports and we've seen the results. It's clear now more than ever that we need to have a sustained plan for what public education has to look like in Michigan. And today, House Democrats are taking a bold step in providing that vision for the state. In this record proposal, not only are we proposing a $24 billion top line funding for school aid, but we are also increasing per pupil allotment to $11,500. We're calling on our Republican colleagues to also join us in codifying the categoricals that mean the most to our districts. That means at-risk funding. That means school lunch. That means the hard-fought wins we delivered for parents and teachers over the last 2 years. When you look at this chart over here, you'll see that over the last 2 decades, education funding has declined. Not until House Democrats came along did we see a sharp increase in K through 12 funding. And it's no surprise, it should be no surprise, that the funding we give our public education, our schools, our teachers, correlates with the outcomes we get. This is adjusted for inflation, just so folks know, right? It's important that we have the facts. It's very easy to saddle our teachers and our public educators by saying, well, we're paying more than ever before, but we're getting worse results. That's not true. It's right here. Okay. Their party and their leadership has had total control for decades, the Republicans. We see that right here, right? And instead of benefiting the public education system, they decided to opt to raid the school aid fund to pay for tax cuts for for-profit schools and for for-profit billionaires like the DeVos family. If we go back to the Snyder days, why higher ed is in here to begin with is because of a very same tax cut we did. Worse, this transfer was often declared justifiable after the implementation of various accountability schemes, A through F, third grade reading laws. These all were developed by Lansing politicians and not by teachers and educators. That's who came up with these ideas. And we want to talk about accountability. I want to talk about equity and funding, making sure they have the resource. If we want to hold people to a high standard, we got to pay them to a high standard. We can't just come out here and try and expect them to meet a goal without giving them the resources to do that. And we've seen this playbook time and again from Republicans. The public to private, the privatization playbook. Underfund something to the point of dysfunction, demonize that dysfunction, and then use it as a justification to further slash funding under the guise of waste elimination or oversight. 40 years of Republican leadership in the state, and our public schools are nearly ran to the ground. In the last 2 years, Democrats have been fighting hard to dig us out of this hole they put us in. What we will do today is make clear that any proposal that will be signed for K-12 will not have our support if it shortchanges our public schools and our educators. We're proposing, in addition to an $11,500 per pupil foundation allowance, we're proposing $500 million in classroom size reduction, $300 million for literacy intervention, $300 million for mental health and school safety, and over $1 billion in school infrastructure grants. These are just a few of the major wins our proposal will have, all without raiding at-risk funding and school lunches. We will not go back to the days where kids come home with school lunch debt. We will not go back to the days where at-risk students that are struggling, are left to hang on the vine. Right now, I want to introduce my colleague, Representative Regina Weiss, who for the last 2 years was the budget chair in the majority and can share the perspective of the wins that we fought for and the reality that we are facing right now as a state. So I want to welcome her up here to say a few words, please.
Thank you, Representative Farhat, and thank you all so much for being here today to talk about this really important proposal that House Dems are putting forward. I am Representative Regina Weiss. I represent House District 5, and I'm a former teacher in the Detroit Public Schools District. I started in the Detroit Public Schools District when it was the Detroit Public Schools in 2011, which is what I often term as one of the worst times to start teaching in the state of Michigan, because in 2011, under the Snyder administration, decision after policy decision that was coming out of Lansing was being weaponized at the classroom level and was having dramatic and irrevocable effects on kids across the state. And I was teaching in Detroit at the time under emergency management. I taught through the EAA, and I taught through other various failed policy decisions that were driven by folks who frankly hadn't been in a classroom since they graduated and had no business setting policy agendas for the state. And so when Rep. Farhat talks about this funding model that you see over here, it's important to know that money matters. And let me just say that this is so critical because we've heard rhetoric that we're delivering historic budgets, but we're getting less results. That is just not true. When you adjust the numbers for inflation and you look at where we're at now, we are spending 25% less today than we were 20 years ago for public education in the state of Michigan. That is shameful. We need to do work to dig our way out of that. And we started doing that work over these past 2 terms, and we want to continue doing that work moving forward, which is why we're putting this proposal here today. And also, this chronic underfunding, as I said, it was made by people who were listening to folks who didn't understand what was important and how to be able to implement these things at the classroom level. We need to make sure that we're listening to teachers. We need to make sure that we're centering educators and students and parents in these conversations. We spent 2 years working to undo as much of the damage as we could, making investments that we know were needed, but 2 years is not enough time to undo 2 decades of underinvestment and failed public policy. It's going to be a slow and steady climb out of the hole that they dug our schools into. And more importantly, record education funding can't just come in a one-size-fits-all investment for everything across the board, because we know that our school districts across the state have differing needs, need different supports. Students across the state have differing needs and need different supports. And we want to make sure that we're meeting those needs and getting those critical investments where they need to go. True equity in funding means ensuring every student has access to the unique set of tools that they need to succeed. For some students in some locations, that requires more or better protected dollars. And for our schools, administrating these programs requires consistency from year to year, which includes passing a budget on time by July 1st. And I'm horrified to already be hearing reports of pink slips going out in districts that I represent and in my community, particularly of support staff, because of the dysfunction that's happening right now in Lansing. It's unacceptable, and we need to do work to correct it. To talk more about that administrative work, I want to hand things off to my colleague, Representative Brenda Carter.
Thank you, Regina. For those of you who do not know me, I'm Representative Brenda Carter, and I represent in Pontiac, Waterford, and Auburn Hills. I'm a grandmother of 7 wonderful kids, and my kids. I didn't come from politics, okay? I didn't come from academia. I came from product assurance and engineering, where everything we had to do had to be precise, accountable, and making sure that nothing leaves the line unless it's well done. And that's exactly what I feel our approach to education should be. When I witnessed in my community what the emergency manager did to our students, I watched how they struggled. I watched how teachers had to take on second jobs in order to teach their beloved kids. I knew that this was no longer an option for me to sit back. I had to run. I had to come to Lansing and make a difference. I served 7 years on the Pontiac School Board, and I was there when the consent agreement consultant came there. I was there when they dismantled our schools. I was there when teachers had to leave. I was there, okay? I witnessed the damage that was done, not only to my district, but low-income districts across the state. Same thing, same playbook that Regina was talking about, what emergency managers did. Instead of looking at the inequities in the schools, they were looking for ways to defund the schools. I'm now in my 4th term in the legislature, and I know what works well, and I know what doesn't work at all. And what works well is putting money into our schools, putting resources into our classrooms. What doesn't work is underfunding the very systems that we need to support. And that's why this budget is more than just about schools. It invests in ecosystems that children need to learn. And you may ask why. Why? I'm speaking the truth here. This is something that I actually went through. And I know that our kids can't learn. They can't do long division if their stomachs are growling. They can't they cannot do their math if they don't know where they're going to sleep at night. They can't even catch up on reading when they're worried about some of the socioeconomic conditions that's happening in their communities. Let me be crystal clear about this. A child in rural Michigan, and I want to just tell you the main reason I ran for the legislature was because I went to two little cities in the Upper Peninsula, Issaquah and Negaunee. And what I saw up there was such poverty that I could not believe it. And I wondered how children learn when they had to travel across such a vast area. Yes, I also believe that a nonverbal child should have the ability to learn how to speak. These programs shouldn't be cut. It's easy to brag about record funding when you gut the very programs that these children need. Universal school meals, transportation, education for the young people up in the Upper Peninsula. It's easy to hand schools a lump sum check and say, good luck, but it's not really. Let us not be confused with this negligence with leadership. We reject the idea that we must choose between fully funding education and supporting students with the greatest needs. This is what we're looking at here, everyone. This is what this proposal is aiming at, cutting categoricals, which is necessary for equity in our school system. Yes, the budget we have here delivers historic funding to our schools, and it protects critical programs that lifts up every child, especially those most in need. This is the vision that our children deserve. It's achievable. It's urgent. And now I will turn this over to my colleague, Carol Glanville.
Thank you, Rep. Carter, and thank you everyone who's here today to support and hear about our proposal. My name is Carol Glanville. I am the ranking member on the School Aid Committee, and I'm also a former educator, like many of my colleagues up here today. And I find this chart particularly interesting because roughly 20 years ago, about 2025, I was trying to boomerang back to Michigan, and there was not a teacher shortage. I struggled to get a job. So I finished up my master's degree and went on into educational technology. And throughout that time, I had the privilege of working not only in our public schools, but also private and charter schools. And I think it's interesting to note that when you cut funding for public schools and you cut the outcomes for public schools, everybody needs to understand that public schools set the standard. Private schools and charter schools have to be at least as good as a public school in order to, and then add something on, in order to attract students. So when we talk about school choice and we continually underinvest in our public schools, we are also tacitly underinvesting in our charters and our privates because the bar gets lowered for everyone. So the choice that we have, that Republicans have, the corner that we've been pushed into is one where none of our students, or all of our students rather, have to fight, right? Really have to fight, and our teachers and our parents alongside them in order to make the gains that they deserve. So with that said, I think the message here today, it's pretty simple. What we present as a caucus is a budget, it's a strong budget that invests in every aspect of our K-12 education system. And it helps to ensure our students can have a successful future. It was developed with the input of teachers, administrators, and education professionals, not just in our caucus, but from across the state. And it reflects the shared priorities of those folks, of our Senate colleagues, and of what we've seen come out of the governor's office. You know, it is a shame that the minority party has been unable to complete this task, right? And that Matt Hall and the House Republicans, we literally have one job as legislators, and that is to pass a budget. And here we are, not even three weeks until our deadline. So the good news is we have done the homework for them. So, you know, if they'd like to, you know, sit down with me and look at, you know, compare answers, I'd be happy to do that. Not going to let them copy, but
They can copy.
you know,
It's okay.
I mean, if they want, we can share our answers and come to, you know, what we think we should be doing here. But honestly, you know, anything less than making sure that all of our students are funded, our schools are funded, our teachers are taken care of, and our families are taken care of. You know, anything less would come at the expense of Michigan's kids, and we will not stand for that. So with that, I will just say the clock is ticking. Let's get this done. Thank you.
Was this budget planned out with the motor fuel tax cut in mind?
So, yeah, so you're talking about the sales tax swap at the pump for roads. You know, that is a bigger implication for the general fund, I would imagine, right? So hold on, I got to finish the answer. So when you talk about swapping sales tax and we're keeping it whole, if you look at the package that we voted out of as a chamber, there was a bill that kept it whole when in passage. And so we anticipate fully that every dollar that goes to the schools now that is collected at the pump will still go at the pump. Will still go to the schools. Yeah.
What's the $1.2 billion for school infrastructure grants?
Yeah, so that's money that we're going to give. There was a report recently that came out that said our schools are drastically underfunded when it comes to infrastructure. $22 billion, and my colleagues can talk about this a little bit more than I can, but there's $22 billion of underfunding for our school infrastructure. And so what we're doing is we're stepping up to that need. We recognize that if we want to create a place kids want to learn in, it's more than you're going to have high-paid teachers, good-paid teachers, you're going to have lunch, but you're going to have a facility. I mean, this is America. I mean, we're a country that should have schools that are the standard for the rest of the world, and Michigan should be no different. So we're putting our money where our values are, and we're saying we want to modernize our schools and take a big step at that. I don't know if anyone wants to add anything to that.
I would just say too, when I talked about my experience teaching in Detroit. When I started teaching in Detroit, I had to put multiple cups up around my room every time it rained because we didn't have a roof that worked. We had cockroaches, we had mice, we had rats. We're not talking about necessarily, when we talk about infrastructure funding, giving every district a state-of-the-art science center. We'd love to do that. We're talking about making sure that schools are safe, welcoming environments to learn in, that people want to, that teachers want to teach in, that students want to come to every day. And we know that there's a great need. We just had the study come out that put a dollar figure on it. And so this is obviously $1 billion is only part of the way there, but it's a start. And we need to have longer term conversations to figure out how we fund us the rest of the way to get to that full number.
My understanding is their need of infrastructure money in part because their local communities have turned down villages to fund that. So I guess if the local communities are making that decision, are you kind of overriding voters and saying, no, we are going to put money in there, even though you guys are going to?
So this is the way that this is written is that it would be a grant process that would run through the Department of Education. Many schools, they're not, you're right that there are some that are turning down bond proposals, but there are many that are meeting already at the cap, and they're still not able to generate enough taxable value to have basic facilities that are safe to learn in. So we know that that's a crisis happening right now, regardless of whether or not they can get a ballot initiative passed. And so we want to make sure that we're taking the steps necessary to make sure that there's funding available to help support those infrastructure needs.
If I can add, and I know Representative Brixey will add something too. I don't, the voters on these ballot initiatives, I can't begin to think why they voted yes or no on a ballot initiative. But I would imagine the thing has to do with affordability. Right now, you're seeing families being made to make very tough decisions about whether or not they can pay rent, buy groceries. And so if you ask them, hey, do you think your school needs improvement? They probably say yes. But the question is, can you afford it? And in that space right there is where we as a state, we've looked at this budget very diligently, and we're like, you know what, we can step up in this space. Because irrespective of the local community's ability to levy a tax millage, that kid deserves to go to a state-of-the-art safe facility. And we're going to put our money where our mouth is. And like you said, it'll be a grant process where people can apply and they can get the money they need. I don't know if you want to add anything.
I want to add a little bit.
So the main reason that schools are suffering inequities in their infrastructure is not because communities are turning down millages. It's because communities cannot raise enough money to pay for the facility that they need. So for example, in 2018, East Lansing put on their ballot a 7 mil tax question to tear down all of their 5 elementary schools and rebuild them. They were all from like the 1950s. They were all really old. They had, leaks, mold. Some of these schools in these older communities are much older than that. So if you look at Flint and if you look at East Lansing, Flint needed new elementary school buildings at the time as well. So East Lansing put a 7 mil bond question out, and the average home value in East Lansing was $200,000, while the average home value in Flint was $20,000, which means to raise that same amount of money, $32 million that they needed to do all of those buildings, and for sure it's going to cost the same amount of money to build 5 new buildings in Flint as it is in East Lansing. They're only 45 minutes away from each other. They would have to pass a 70 mil bond to pay for that. And so because we rely on property taxes to provide the structures that our children learn in, we still have a deficit in the way that we provide for our education services. And children in rural areas that have low land values and children in highly urban areas that have low property values, they suffer the same fate. They cannot afford to make the improvements to their school buildings that the children need.
And that's
this money isn't going to go to a Zen center in Novi?
I don't.
I mean, I'll just say, look, we're going to guarantee it goes to public schools for public. I don't know the specifics of an earmark, if that was an earmark or not, right? We're talking about a grant process through MDE, Department of Education, that's going to facilitate a requirement for an application, a submission to a public school for a public purpose. This isn't, at one point, we're not proposing 1.2 billion in earmarks. What we're saying is schools have a need. They should be able to apply to the state for assistance and relief in that. And that's what we're proposing. I mean, there's the Zen centers and there's the hip hop academies and there's a Jason Wentworth health facility, right? I mean, those are great questions. And I agree with you. I'm glad we have some earmark reform that's coming through to address that. But what we're saying is we want it to be a transparent, competitive process where schools that have the greatest need get the money so these kids don't suffer in a classroom where there's multiple cups lying around. I mean, that's what we're saying. I mean, Republicans are saying we need to give Betsy DeVos another tax cut, the personal income tax cut. What we're saying is we can spend this money better than that. We can give more value. The average Michigander is going to benefit $50, $60 on that tax proposal. I mean, when the reality is there's real needs. And we're not going to allow them to burn down our public education system here to pay for frivolous tax. We're just not going to do that. We're not going to do that. And I'm fairly confident there's a consensus with all the chambers on that. So, but thank you for the question. That was a good question.
I do want to make one comment on that because I represent the district that you've been hearing about, where infrastructure is sorely needed. Schools are over 50 years old. Our children are not able to get the resources that they need. And I applaud my colleagues here. I've heard conversation here that they understand the needs of Detroit, Flint, Saginaw, Ishpeming, Negaunee, and all of our poor districts where we should be putting our children first, okay? It didn't matter where it was, Upper Peninsula, Lower Peninsula. If you can't afford to take care of your children and pay for a bond millage or feed your family, and this is what goes on every day in my district, okay? So I want to make sure that that point is really clear. It's not about somebody getting a personal gain out of this. It's about taking care of who we were sent here to represent, and that's our kids.
What is the higher ed in this budget?
Yeah, so I'll touch on that very briefly, and then I'm going to hand it off to our higher ed chair, Matt Longjohn, and Sam Stuckloff to touch on this. Very, very high level. We do plan on shifting higher ed out of the school aid fund, put it in general fund. We plan on giving it a 4% bump, right, for operation costs for our community colleges and our universities. And that will preserve, again, their ability to be competitive and stay active. Again, I want to bring up Rep. Longjohn and Stuckloff to talk about this, who've done a fabulous job on that budget. You know, again, if I can guarantee you, if we were writing these budgets, we all would at least know what they look like by now, or to be done. I mean, and Julie Brixey here, she did a great job breaking down property taxes, so thank you for that. So.
And if, while you're talking about the higher ed budget, can you talk a little bit about the fact that correct numbers, our school aid fund numbers were more consistent. General fund is where it didn't hit, so can the general fund sustain moving higher ed?
So
Yeah.
yeah, we're going to let them touch on that, and then I'll come back.
Sure. I'll just jump in first. Representative Matt Longjohn from 40th House District, Portage, Texas Township, Oshtemo, Kalamazoo County. Yes, so the way to keep higher ed intact and to provide the 4% increase in operational costs, and even some other things that Representative Steckloff is going to talk about in terms of duals, the students who are in high school taking college classes, et cetera, that can all be paid for. And the way that we know this can be paid for is by making the choices that put our kids first. I've said on the campaign trail and for years as a product of public education that these budgets are value statements, and that's what you'll find here. The answer is that Speaker Hall has been writing checks that he can't cash. If you pass a bill that says we're going to cut income tax revenues by $700 million, those dollars will pay for the things that I just listed. So this is an easy pay for. In my district, if you ask people in families like mine and across my district whether they would relinquish what the House Republicans have proposed as a $55 to $71 income tax break per year in exchange for fully funding the things that we care about in K-12 and keeping higher ed intact, the answer would be yes. But Representative Steckloff has been working on this for many more years than I have, and I'd like her to please jump in.
Gently. Thanks, Rep. Longjohn. We did some incredible investments in higher education last term. We have seen that our colleges and universities have been critically underfunded for many years, most of the time receiving less than inflation in their ongoing funds. There's a lot of work that can be done, which is why we are working at a 4% increase. I also think it's really important to talk about what we were able to do to reduce the cost of education for our students. Last term, we invested more into the Michigan Achievement Scholarship, $5,500 for all four-year public and private students. That severely cuts the cost. But I want to focus on the Michigan Achievement Scholarship because this is the first scholarship we've seen this century that actually affects the middle class. Over 60,000 students have been participating in the Michigan Achievement Scholarship. On top of that, we created a community college for all. Those who live in an in-district are able to go to community college for free. One of the new options that we have been providing is we've seen so many students wanting to get invested in higher education at a younger age, really working on dual enrollment. So currently, dual enrollment comes out of your foundation allowance. And depending on the school, you will see that, some schools push you more towards dual enrollment, some schools push you more towards AP courses. So we want to invest in dual enrollment. And it's not just dual enrollment at your typical community college or higher ed. Many of these programs can be done for CTE programs, making sure that students can graduate high school with an associate's degree already paid for. So by putting about $50 million into a dual enrollment program, taking it out of the foundation allowance, it provides more opportunity, more leverage for students to get those college credits before heading to college. I want to make it very clear. We know college isn't for everyone. But what should be for everyone is the opportunity for that education, and that's what we're providing for the students here in Michigan.
We've got time for one more question.
Can we just, I'm sorry if I missed this earlier, but just a broad overview of great things out with Republicans, Representative Lambert, Representative Farhad. Have you heard from Representative Kelly about what's going on with the school aid budget? What's the last updates you got?
I think he might still be finding out what's happening with the school aid budget as we speak.
Within the hour, they just posted for committee in the morning with a open agenda, so we are not sure what will be on that agenda.
And so hopefully he'll figure it out. Maybe he heard about this press conference and is excited to just adopt what we're recommending. Again, so this is a budget, the numbers, here's what I'll say. Bold ideas require a level of courage that we are all capable of carrying here. The easy thing is to continue to allow public schools to be defunded, to cry and say, oh, well, public education is failing. That's the easy thing. That's the thing that, some of my Republican colleagues want to do. We're not going to do that here. So when I'm asked about CREC and these other things, one, we have the money to fully do this proposal. We have the funding to move higher ed to the general fund if we choose to do so. What we don't have the money for is frivolous tax cuts to benefit the wealthiest 1% in our state. I'll say again, the average Michigander will benefit $50 a year under the Republican tax cut. You mentioned CREC. If you want to look, let's unwind the numbers of CREC a little bit. Why was there a little bit of softening? Higher than ever tax returns were filed for EITC and the pension tax. That's a good thing. And that's something we all did. We did that because we wanted targeted relief for our state's middle class, not the billionaires, not the mega millionaires, not the people who are hoping that public education fails so they can buy those buildings, profit off those kids, and force them into a cycle where their opportunity isn't. Their outcomes are not their top priority. It's the bottom line and their profit margin is. That's what they're trying to do. What we did is we uplifted our state's working class. And that's one of the reasons if you look at CREC, tax returns, tax filings were higher than anticipated. That's okay. That's a good thing. We did that. We knew that was going to happen to some degree.
And I guess, Representative Weiss, you kind of touched upon this earlier, but just broad strokes, the practical implications if this budget doesn't get done by July 1, if we're still pushing midsummer, you say you already heard of teachers getting pink slipped. What should parents expect for this fall? Are they not going to have schools to send their kids back to? Is it that disaster scenario?
Yeah, and before I ask you if you indulge me, I want to backtrack a little bit on the last question too, because I think this is important when we talk about higher ed and community college dollars and school aid. Obviously, higher ed and community college funding is critically important, and we prioritize that, which is why we included a 4% increase. But traditionally, the general fund has contributed over the years more to the school aid fund than the school aid fund has contributed to the general fund. That changed in 2013 under the Snyder administration to pay for corporate tax cuts. And since then, more and more money has been shifted out of school aid to fund higher education and community college. Those were policy decisions. And the result is that chart that you see over here. The result is this, 2013. And that's what we see. We don't need to do this anymore. We have the ability, and we've shown our work here, that we can actually shift these dollars out, these dollars back into the general fund. We can pay for it, and we can use those dollars to do what they were intended to do originally, which is to make sure we are fully funding, as close to fully funding as we can our K-12 system. And Colin, to your question about what does this look like, the outlook, if we don't get the budget done on time, and what parents should expect, unfortunately, it's going to be different from district to district. And the answer is we don't really know. There's a lot of uncertainty. Our district's going to be able to pay for meals for all students when they come back to school in the fall. Because remember, school starts in August. Yep. School starts in August. If we don't have a budget passed before kids are back in seats, districts are having to make really difficult decisions about how they're spending their dollars. Our fiscal year ends on September 30th, but kids are back in school in mid-August. And so will they have access to free meals? We don't know. That's going to be a district by district decision. Will there be class size increases? There could be. Will there be cuts to support staff like paraprofessionals who help our special education students? Probably in many districts, you will see a lot of that staff go away. And that is terrifying. That is going to have real negative educational outcomes immediately, starting in August, if we don't do our work and get our budget passed by July 1st. And so I am imploring every House Republican who is listening. We are organized. We've done the work. We know how to get this done. We are ready to negotiate, but we need to get a budget passed by July 1st.
And if I could just add to that, I think perhaps what we need to mention is that football might be in danger.
Yeah.
And it sounds a little funny, right? I'm trying to lighten the mood, but it's true. If we can't hire coaches back, if we can't have athletic staff, because those are the kinds of things that go first, the non-essentials, right? And I would argue that sports are essential. And I know in my area, Friday night football still carries quite a bit of weight. And it's an advantage to our kids. It's how some of them are planning on going to college through scholarship. And so those are some of the other things that are being left out on the table. And I would just say, we talk about tax cuts or not and how we're going to spend the money, but we all need to remember, fundamentally, this is an investment. This is an investment in the future of the state of Michigan. We talk about an aging Michigan. We talk about attracting people and keeping them in Michigan. If we have a solid school system, people will stay. They will grow. They will be successful. Their families will put down roots. Other people will come. Like, education is the pathway, and we need to be smart about how we are investing our money in the future of the state of Michigan. And it starts with this education plan.
A real brief comment to you, Colin. I received a call today on the way up here from somebody that I never thought I would get a call from again, and that was the consent agreement consultant who helped with Pontiac's issues that they had. Don Weatherspoon told me, he said, if the Republican budget passed the way it is, it would be catastrophic to Pontiac School District. We are a district that depends on categoricals. So I'm not, like many other districts that are struggling with poverty, as Weatherspoon said, it would be catastrophic.
Colin, I just want to address the pink slip issue you asked about. It's really simple. If we don't tell schools how much money they have to work with, how are they supposed to negotiate a contract? They have to play it more conservatively because they don't know how much money the state's going to afford them in order to pay their teachers, their support staff, their admin, etc. If we don't give them that basic tool to negotiate, then we are derelict in our responsibilities as legislators.
So I think that's it. We're going to wrap it up. Thank you, everybody, for your time. Again, I want to make one message very clear. We welcome the collaboration with our Republican colleagues. We welcome it. Well, we're here today. We'll be here. I know some of them are here today. We'll be here throughout the week. The speaker has time and again made it clear that he agrees that the corporations have had the gravy train in the state, and so again, we should undo the system that's allowed these corporations to continue to profit off our kids. That's really what it is. In 2013, we paid for a tax cut. Maybe we got to look at that again, right? I mean, again, if it's too long, it's time to give the working families of our